Today we're going to talk about naming things. Now, first of all, here's a little bit of a story. Seems kind of irrelevant, but it kind of is. Way back in elementary school, I absolutely hated writing a how to essay. And this was because it was very formulaic. You had to write it in this specific way, following these specific rules, or else you were not going to make that great of a grade. So I felt it was stifling my creativity, and I even created a how to essay on how to write how to essays, in which I purposely broke every single rule. I had a piece of paper with different colors, and my paragraphs were actually all over the place, and it was kind of a fun project. Now, I did not turn that in. That was something that I did because, strangely enough, I found it fun. Um, but that being said, you could see why when I learned that in programming that you could name your variables whatever you wanted, why that was very, very appealing to me. But today, we're actually going to talk about why naming your variables whatever you want is actually a bad idea. And this is something that I've learned through the years because I will admit, when I first started out, many, 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 many years ago, 18 years ago professionally, but then I actually started programming for fun even before that, probably about 5 years before. But I had fun with those variable names. I would purposely think of the weirdest names I could possibly use, and I had themes going on in my programs that had nothing to do with what the actual program was doing. So let's talk about why that's a horrible idea. Why should we actually give thought to what we name our variables? Well, for one thing, let's imagine right now that we're reading some code. And our code has variable names such as cats and tables and X and Y and Z. How easy is it going to be to follow the logic of that code? You couldn't sit down and read it like you would read a book. You can't treat it like it's the English language or whatever language that you speak. You have to be constantly translating in your head. Okay, so I remember that this variable here called Z actually is referring to the tax rate. So every time I see Z, I have to translate in my head to tax rate. Now that can get tiring, and very likely if you're doing that, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to lose track of it because we're not usually looking at a small script that's 100 lines or less. Typically, we're going to look at a huge code base that has a whole lot of moving parts to it. And there's no way you could track each variable. So, doing that constant mental translation isn't going to work. Now, imagine on the other hand, you're reading your code and the variable names actually describe the data that they hold. Well, in that case, it's going to be a lot easier to follow. And not only that, but your method names also describe exactly what they do. Now, there's several reasons that's a great idea. One of them is what we've already talked about. You're going to be able to understand it better when you're reading it. That means you right now. That also means you in 6 months. That means other developers. Your code's going to be a lot easier to navigate, and you're going to spend less time figuring out what in the world the code does whenever you're trying to add a new feature or fix a bug or just change something. So that's one really big reason why we should give attention to naming. And the cool thing is, for those of you who hate writing comments, if you name things appropriately, you can greatly reduce the amount of comments you need in your code. So if you have a method that's called calculate tax rate, then you don't need a comment in there that says this method calculates tax rate. You already have self-documented what that method does, just in the name. Now, if there's some very specific formula you're using in order to calculate the tax rate, maybe you're referencing a website that has information on tax brackets, which I mean would be kind of interesting because that type of data might change frequently. That might be something better if you had some sort of API if you could access that would get you the current data all the time. But I don't really but for the sake of this argument, we're going to stick with even lousy examples. But anyway, let's say you have a link that you were using that gave you tax bracket information, and your formula, not necessarily your code, but your formula, if you were to take that code, that formula, and take it out of the code and write it on a piece of paper, that formula is coming from that website. So you might document what the formula is. You might put a brief explanation of it. You might put a link to the website, because you're describing now not what the code is doing, but you're describing the purpose of the code. So you're pretty much saying this formula here, this piece of code here does this. It's written this way because of this reason. And that is actually when you want to comment. When you're trying to describe something other than what your code is doing. Now, to describe what your code is doing, just name things appropriately. It'll be a lot easier to follow. But to describe why your code is doing something, then add a comment that's going to be helpful to you in 6 months, and it's also going to be helpful to any other developers working in your code, especially if you do something kind of weird, maybe something that seems kind of hacky and it goes well against best practices. It's not the obvious answer. It's not something you would do in most cases, but you have a reason that you did it there. Then definitely add a comment and explain the context. But that tangent aside, let's get back to naming conventions. So you've named your methods appropriately. Your calculate tax rate method does exactly that. Your tax rate variable is exactly that. It holds the tax rate. You can follow your code logically just by reading it, just like you would read a book. But let's look at another thing. Let's say you're in your calculate tax rate method, and you have your formula to get the tax rate, but you also have some other little side code over here, and you realize that your method is not just calculating the tax rate. It is calculating the tax rate and applying that to payroll. And so now you realize, okay, my method's not named accurately now because that's not what this method's doing. Well, you could do one of two things. You could rename your method. You could call it calculate tax rate and apply to payroll. And now it's accurate again. And if you read it, you know what it does. You're good. But then again, the principle of clean coding that says that you want your method to do one thing and one thing only. You don't want it to have multiple responsibilities. You just want it to have one responsibility. And so you look at your method now and you're seeing, oh, wow, this method name is getting pretty long. Wait a second, that indicates that it's trying to do more than one thing. And so in that case, it might be a great idea to create another method. That's a hint that, hey, I'm glad I was naming these methods accurately, because now that made it very obvious to me that my method is trying to do too much. And so now I create a separate method. I have cleaner code. It's easier to follow, easier to read. If this one method here breaks, then I'm not having to worry about the other calculation, the calculation about applying to payroll, because the only thing that broke was the tax rate calculation. So I can focus on just this method. And that brings us to another reason why naming is very important, is when you have a bug. Let's say you have a bug and the bug is, hey, the tax rate is being calculated wrong. Now, if you named everything appropriately, your first big hint as far as where to look, if you don't have a very helpful error message that gives you a line number, is the method called calculate tax rate. Why? Because your bug is that it's calculating the tax rate incorrectly. And that might not be where your bug ends up being. Maybe it's in a method that calls the calculate tax rate method, or it's in a method that uses the tax rate that is being calculated there. But either way, it's an excellent starting point. You went from having no idea where the bug was to, oh, because I named this appropriately, I can actually find the bug and I can start doing something about it. So that's another great reason to name things correctly. Another one is if you're adding new features and you know that this feature over here, to maybe you have the calculate tax rate method already and you're adding a method to apply it to payroll. It's a new feature. Well, you're adding this new feature and you're realizing, oh, if I'm applying a tax rate to payroll, I need to know what the tax rate is. You can quickly scan your code and see you already have that functionality there. And so it's just a simple matter of looking over the method, seeing, okay, this is what I need, and then using it in your new feature. Whereas if you named it something vague, something that wouldn't work, like let's say you named your method, just named it X or something random like that that's non-descriptive. Well, you're not going to know what that method is. You're going to have no idea that you already have a method that calculates your tax rate, because usually we're working in the scope of a very large piece of software that has a lot of moving pieces. You're not going to have every little thing memorized. And so if you use a random name, it's not going to help you as you add features, especially if you're adding features a year from now. Or if you are working in a code base that maybe someone else built, maybe you don't know what methods are even in there. But if the previous programmer used good naming, then you're going to be able to find things a whole lot easier. And so that's another reason. It's really going to make you work faster, because you're going to have at a glance what's already in the program, what's not in there yet, and what can I use, what doesn't make any sense to use here, what's missing, what do I need to add. It's going to be a lot easier to find these things. Of course, you still have to actually dig into the code and see what it's doing, because someone could name a method calculate tax rate and find out, oh, it doesn't calculate tax rate. It does something completely different. Or maybe it calculates tax rate, but it has a side effect. And so it does something unexpected that is actually going to break your new feature that you're trying to add. And so even though it's named, someone was making some effort to name things appropriately, it's still going to be important to give it a look over, make sure you understand what the code is doing, and if it actually matches the name of the method. And if it doesn't, that's an opportunity for you to leave the code base better than when you got there, because you can improve the name or break up the method. Maybe it's trying to do too many things and now you split it out. Or maybe it's just named wrong and you change the name. And then you go and you create your own calculate tax rate method that does just that. So that really covers a lot of the topics for why you would name something appropriately in maybe a very small development team. Maybe it's just you working by yourself. Maybe it's you working on it by yourself for now, but there's going to be other developers working on it in the future. But we're really looking at the basic problem, a very small team, one person's involved, one person at a time anyway. And so the point there is just make sure things make sense. If it doesn't make sense, then someone's going to get confused, whether it's you or someone else. If it does make sense, it's going to really make you work a whole lot faster. But what about if you're working on a large team or even a medium-sized team and you have your ideas about how something should be named, but your teammates have different ideas? It doesn't matter. Well, it does. It does and it doesn't. So it doesn't matter which way you go with. If they're both clear, if they're both understandable, either one could work. However, it does matter that you all follow the same rules. And the reason for that is because the way that you name things in your project, it starts to form a language. So if your methods, for example, are always verbs, and you see something that says calculate tax rate, then you know, okay, calculate, that's a verb. I know that that's a method. Or if you see something that says tax rate calculator, that's a noun. I know that that's a class. Or if you see a very small word and it's just tax rate, okay, now I can identify that as a variable. And the reason that that matters is as your project begins to develop a language, you're going to want it to be a consistent language. You're going to want other people that you're working with on the team to be able to jump into a part of the code that they're not that familiar with and still be able to understand it because it follows the same naming conventions that they're used to. And so here's a great time to realize that compromise is important, because this is an area where opinion actually plays a big part, and maybe there's multiple ideas, there's multiple opinions, and none of them are clearly better than the other. But what does matter here is that everyone agrees on the same one. So even if it's not your preference, if you could pick one and go with it and stick with it, it's going to be better than if you just keep doing the naming convention that you prefer while ignoring what the rest of the team has went with. Like personally, I worked on a team where we did put a lot of thought into naming things. We had discussions about what are we going to name this variable? What are we going to name this method or this class? And for the most part, I agreed with my coworkers. But there were a few times where I personally felt, oh, the name that they're wanting to go with is way too long. And that's slowing me down when I read the code. But instead of just insisting on my way and saying, hey, no, this is too long, we can't do names like this ever, it's actually a better option to just say, okay, here's what I think. I think it's better with a shorter name, but let's work together. We're trying to build a common language here. Everyone has a say in how that language gets built. And it's better to just cooperate and to agree, even when it's not your preference. Now, there are times where I would say, hey, actually, I really think this name is too long because, but I would only mention it if there was a real reason behind it. Like, if the name really was too wordy, then yeah, go ahead, bring it up. But in the end, the main goal here is coming up with something that everyone can work with. So that's one thing to look at how you name things as a language. Because if everyone was supposedly speaking the same language, but made up their own rules, and each person had a different set of rules for how to speak that language, no one would be communicating. And so on a medium-sized to large team, you have multiple developers. You want to make sure you have good communication. And one way to do that is to follow a standard way of naming things. whether that means coming up with some rule that you're just going to follow for that project, even if you don't like it, or even if it comes to let's all get together and discuss what do we want to name this thing, because it really does make a difference. So that would be something that larger teams would want to consider, is their own personalized language as applied to the project. But what about bigger groups of people? We're talking about, let's say in Python, your variable names are going to be typically lowercase, and you're going to put an underscore in between each word. And that's according to the guidelines. If you look up what is the standard way to name your variables in Python, that's going to be the recommendation. And you'll see, like for a method name, you'll see similar recommendations. For a class name, however, you'll see a different recommendation. And in fact, there you'll see that the first letter needs to be capitalized. If there's multiple words, you just capitalize each word. Is it possible to create Python variable names and method names and class names that don't follow those guidelines? Of course it is. You can do all sorts of things. You can use camel case for your variables. You can use underscores in your class names, however you want. It's not going to crash your code. However, once again, we're talking about creating a language that other people are going to quickly understand. And so if you're in a project and it's a Python project, you're going to expect to see naming conventions that follow typical Python projects, typical Python guidelines. And if you're seeing something different, it might get confusing. Or maybe on this side of the project, you're seeing the naming convention following one method, and then over here, you're seeing something entirely different. That also can be confusing. So the key here isn't that, oh, it's better to have your variables lowercase with underscores, but the key here is, once again, communication and consistency. That consistency will allow communication. It will allow other developers to follow the code a whole lot easier. And it even helps you too. So if you feel like using underscores one day and camel case another day, well, you don't realize it, but when you read the code, if it follows a consistent format, you don't have to do any thinking whatsoever to realize, okay, that's a method, that's a variable, that's a class. You just see it and you know it automatically. But if you're using a mixture of methods, it's not going to be quite so automated. And so you're actually making yourself less efficient by mixing and matching. And if you have new developers jump into the project, they might be a little bit confused as well. And if you're trying to bring in, let's say you pull in a new library and you want to extend the library by making your own methods on top of the library, it's just better if you're consistent with the guidelines, because now your custom library is going to be consistent with the original library, and it's going to be easier for other developers to use it. And so that's what the naming conventions really comes down to, is consistency, even if the rule seems silly, because it improves communication between developers, and even between you and yourself 6 months from now. And so I would highly recommend picking some rules and following them, even if you're not a rule follower. That's it for today. If you have any great ideas on topics that I can cover, please put that down in the comments, and take care.